My name is Tyler Bennett, and the moment my father smashed the last bottle of my hot sauce against the garage floor, watching the amber liquid spread across the concrete like spilled blood, he didn't yell. He spoke with the kind of cold certainty that cuts deeper than any scream. You're wasting your life on a fantasy that will never amount to anything. The glass shards glittered under the fluorescent lights, each fragment reflecting a different version of the failure he'd already decided I was. It wasn't the destruction of 6 months of recipe development that hollowed me out. It was the absolute conviction in his voice, the way he said it like he was stating a fact as basic as gravity, that I would never build anything worth remembering. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That was the morning I understood the man who raised me wasn't protecting me from disappointment. He was engineering it brick by brick, making sure I stayed small enough to fit inside the shadow he cast. And the worst part was discovering he'd been doing it deliberately, systematically, for years, while I kept believing that one day he'd finally see what I was capable of building. The alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, cutting through the darkness with a sound that felt almost sacred. I trained myself to wake before the sun because those quiet hours belonged only to me, untouched by my father's commentary or my brother Brandon's smirking observations about my little hobby business. The garage was cold this early, my breath forming small clouds as I moved between the stainless steel prep table and the industrial burner I'd bought secondhand from a restaurant liquidation sale. Everything in this space had been built from Craigslist finds, farmers market profits, and the kind of stubborn belief that keeps you moving forward even when every voice around you says to stop. I was bottling the last batch of Ember and Oak's new Chipotle blend, the one that had taken me 4 months to perfect. The label design sat on my laptop screen, waiting for final approval before I sent it to the printer. Each bottle represented something more than hot sauce. It was proof that I could create something people wanted, something that made them come back to my farmer's market booth week after week asking when I'd have more inventory. The recipe had started as an experiment 2 years ago, mixing peppers I'd grown myself with oak smoke spices, and a hint of local honey that gave it a complexity nobody expected from something you'd find at a weekend market stall. The house above me was still sleeping, but I knew that peace wouldn't last. Today was the Regional Small Business Expo at the Austin Convention Center, and I'd paid $300 I barely had for a vendor booth. It was the kind of investment that made my stomach tight with anxiety, but Jordan Hayes had convinced me it was time to stop playing small. Jordan had been there from the beginning, back when Ember and Oak was just me giving away sample bottles to friends and pretending I wasn't terrified of what would happen if I actually tried to turn it into something real. Jordan understood what it meant to build something from nothing, to wake up at 4:30 because the dream was bigger than the fear. I sealed the last bottle and stepped back, looking at the 3 cases stacked and ready to load into my truck. 72 bottles of something I'd created with my own hands, each one a small act of defiance against every conversation where my father had dismissed this as a phase I'd eventually outgrow. The garage smelled like smoke and vinegar and possibility, a scent I'd come to associate with the version of myself I was becoming when nobody was watching. When I walked into the kitchen just after 6, the house had already divided itself into its familiar territories. My mother stood at the island, arranging pastries on a platter while checking her phone, coordinating something for Brandon's corporate presentation later that week. My father sat in his usual chair, reading the business section of the newspaper with the kind of focused intensity he reserved for things he deemed important. Brandon was upstairs, probably still sleeping off whatever client dinner he'd attended the night before, the kind of networking event that always earned our father's approval and detailed questions about who he'd met and what deals were forming. Then I walked in carrying my sample case, and the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it crystallized into something sharp enough to cut. My father glanced up, saw the bottles, and returned to his newspaper without a word. My mother offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the expression she'd perfected over the years whenever she wanted to acknowledge my presence without actually engaging with what I was doing. No one asked about the expo. No one wondered why I was dressed in the button-down shirt I'd pressed the night before, or why I'd been up before dawn preparing for something that clearly mattered to me. That silence had its own language, one I'd been learning to read since I was 14 and told my father I wanted to start a business instead of joining his real estate development company. He'd laughed then, not cruelly, but with the kind of casual dismissal that somehow hurt worse than anger. He'd said entrepreneurship was for people who couldn't hack it in established industries, that real success came from building on proven foundations, not chasing fantasies in a garage. Brandon had been standing right there, nodding along, already positioning himself as the son who understood how the world actually worked. I poured coffee into my travel mug, the sound too loud in the quiet kitchen. My father turned a page, the newspaper crackling with finality. I wanted to say something to force them to acknowledge that today mattered, but the words felt too heavy to lift. So I did what I'd learned to do best. I picked up my sample case, grabbed my truck keys, and headed toward the door that would take me away from this house, and toward the one place where what I'd built actually meant something to someone. The drive to the convention center took 20 minutes, but my mind was already racing backward, pulled into memories I tried to keep locked away. They surfaced anyway, rising like oil through water, impossible to ignore when hope started building. I thought about the summer after high school graduation, when I'd worked 60-hour weeks at a landscaping company to save money for culinary school. I'd researched programs, filled out applications, written essays about wanting to understand food science and flavor profiles so I could eventually build a food business. The acceptance letter had come in a thick envelope that made my hands shake when I opened it. I'd shown it to my father in his home office, the room that smelled like leather and expensive bourbon, and the weight of decisions that shaped other people's lives. He'd read it once, set it down on his desk between a property acquisition contract and his calendar, and told me I was being impractical. Brandon was already enrolled in business school at UT Austin, following the path that made sense that led somewhere real. My father said there would be other opportunities, better uses of that tuition money, smarter investments in my future. He suggested I take a year to work in his company, learn the real estate business, see what actual commerce looked like. That year turned into 2, then 3. The culinary school money never reappeared in any account with my name on it. When I finally asked about it, my mother had looked uncomfortable and said something vague about family expenses and Brandon's networking opportunities and how these things balance out over time. I was 23 years old before I realized the money hadn't disappeared into family expenses. It had been redirected, deliberately, into Brandon's graduate school fund and the down payment on his first investment property. My father had co-signed those documents. He'd made a choice about which son's dreams deserved funding, and I hadn't even been in the room when it happened. Those memories pulsed as I unloaded cases from my truck, trying to focus on arranging my booth when an old anger started heating the back of my throat. I'd built Ember and Oak without their money, without their approval, without anything except the tiny apartment I'd rented in East Austin and the garage space a sympathetic landlord let me use for production. Every bottle cap, every label, every ingredient had been paid for with farmers' market profits, and the kind of hustle that left me exhausted but unable to stop because stopping meant proving my father right. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Jordan confirming they'd be there by 9 to help with the booth setup and bring the banner we'd designed together. Their message ended with 3 flame emojis and the words, "Today's the day we go big." I smiled despite the knot in my stomach, despite the echo of my father's voice telling me this was all a waste of energy that could be better spent on something legitimate. Another text came through before I could set the phone down. This one from my mother, the words appearing on the screen like a gentle warning wrapped in concern. "Your father's in a mood today. Brandon closed a major deal yesterday. Maybe wait to talk about your market thing until tonight when things settle down." Not a question about my expo. Not a word of encouragement or curiosity. Just a reminder to stay small, stay quiet. Don't disturb the ecosystem that had been carefully balanced around Brandon's achievements and my father's vision of what success was supposed to look like. I stared at that message for longer than I should have, feeling something shift and harden inside my chest. I'd spent years trying to time my existence around my father's moods, waiting for the right moment to be seen, believing that if I was just patient enough and successful enough and undeniable enough, he'd finally look at what I'd built and recognize it as real. But standing in that convention center hall, surrounded by other small business owners setting up their dreams in 10 by 10 booth spaces, I understood something I'd been avoiding. There would never be a right time. There would never be enough success to earn his approval, because he'd already decided what my story was supposed to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And it didn't include me building something he hadn't designed himself. I texted back a single word. Okay. Then I turned off my phone and went back to arranging bottles of hot sauce that represented every early morning and late night I'd chosen myself over his certainty about my limitations. The booth was starting to take shape, the banner Jordan designed hanging crisp and professional above the table, when other vendors began filtering in. A woman 2 booths down was setting up handcrafted leather goods. A man across the aisle had a display of locally roasted coffee. We were all here doing the same thing, building something from nothing while the world tried to convince us to be reasonable. Jordan arrived exactly at 9, carrying 2 breakfast tacos and wearing a shirt that said, "Support local or stay quiet," across the front. They took one look at my face and knew immediately that the morning had already tried to break me. Jordan didn't ask questions. They just handed me a taco, squeezed my shoulder, and said what they always said when my family's gravity tried to pull me backward. "You're doing it anyway. That's what matters." The expo floor opened to attendees at 10, and within the first hour, I knew something was different. People weren't just sampling and moving on. They were tasting, pausing, asking questions about ingredients and production methods and where they could buy more. A food blogger spent 15 minutes at my booth, taking photos and asking about my process. A restaurant owner from South Congress took my information and said he wanted to discuss wholesale pricing. Every conversation felt like validation, like proof that what I'd built in my garage wasn't just a fantasy I was too stubborn to abandon. By noon, I'd sold 40 bottles and collected 30 business cards from buyers interested in larger orders. Jordan kept catching my eye across the booth, grinning with the kind of pride that made my throat tight. This was working. After 2 years of farmers markets and friends of friends and building so slowly, I sometimes wondered if I was moving at all. Something was finally shifting into a bigger gear. That's when I saw her. A woman in a navy blazer moving through the aisles with a purpose that separated her from the casual browsers. She stopped at the coffee roaster's booth, spent several minutes in conversation, then moved to the leather goods display. She was taking notes, scanning, evaluating with the kind of attention that meant she was here for business, not browsing. When she reached my booth, she didn't sample first. She looked at my banner, my labels, my setup, taking in the whole presentation before she spoke. "Tell me about your product," she said, and something in her directness made me stand straighter. I gave her the story I'd practiced 100 times but never stopped meaning. The locally sourced peppers, the oak smoking process that gave it depth, the balance between heat and flavor that made people come back. I handed her a sample on a tortilla chip and watched her face shift from professional interest to genuine surprise. "How long have you been in production?" she asked, already reaching for a second sample. 2 years of steady production. Small batch, all handmade, currently selling at farmers markets and a few local stores. She nodded, making notes on her tablet. Production capacity if demand increased significantly? My heart started beating faster. This wasn't casual interest. I'd need to scale up, but the recipes and processes are documented. Everything's replicable. She looked at me then, really looked the way people do when they're deciding if you're serious or just playing at business. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, regional buyer for Walmart's local artisan program. We're expanding our Texas producers line, and I've been scouting the expo for products that fit our criteria. Your hot sauce is exactly what we're looking for." The world narrowed down to those words. Walmart. Regional buyer. Exactly what we're looking for. Jordan had gone completely still beside me, and I could feel their shock matching my own. Jennifer continued, her voice level and business-focused, like she was offering something routine instead of life-changing. "I'd like to schedule a meeting at our Bentonville office next week to discuss terms for a trial run in 50 Texas stores. If the trial performs well, we'd look at expanding to regional, possibly national distribution. Are you interested in exploring that conversation?" I heard myself say yes, watched myself exchange contact information, maintained something close to professional composure while she explained next steps and timelines and what documentation I'd need to bring to the meeting. She took 3 bottles with her, shook my hand with a firm grip that felt like a door opening, and moved on to the next booth like she hadn't just validated everything I'd built while everyone told me I was chasing nothing. The moment she was out of sight, Jordan grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. "Did that just happen? Did Walmart just ask to stock your hot sauce?" Their voice cracked on the last word, and suddenly we were both laughing. The kind of half-hysterical sound that comes when something you didn't let yourself believe in suddenly becomes real. I pulled out my phone to call someone to share this with and stopped. My finger hovered over my father's contact, muscle memory from a lifetime of seeking his approval. But something made me hesitate, some instinct that whispered this moment was too new and too fragile to expose to his particular brand of certainty. Instead, I texted Jordan's phone so they'd have the details saved, then put mine away and went back to selling bottles to people who saw what I'd made and wanted to take it home with them. The rest of the expo passed in a blur of conversations and sales and business cards exchanged with trembling hands. By the time we packed up at 6, I'd sold all 72 bottles, collected over 100 potential wholesale contacts, and scheduled a meeting that could change the entire trajectory of what Ember and Oak could become. Jordan helped me load the empty cases into my truck, both of us moving in a daze, unable to quite process what had shifted in the span of 8 hours. "You have to tell them," Jordan said as I closed the truck bed. "Your family. You have to tell them about Walmart." I nodded, but something in my stomach went tight and cold. I knew my family. I knew how these conversations went. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, with something this undeniable, this real, my father would finally see what I'd been building while he wasn't looking. I drove home as the sun started dropping toward the horizon, turning the Austin sky into layers of orange and pink and gold. The city looked different somehow, sharper, more full of possibility. I rehearsed the words in my head, trying to find the right way to say it that wouldn't sound like I was gloating, that would just present the facts and let them speak for themselves. Walmart wanted to stock my product. A regional buyer had sought me out. This was real. The house was bright when I pulled into the driveway, every window glowing with warmth that should have felt welcoming but instead made my shoulders tense. I could see movement in the kitchen through the window, my mother setting the table while my father and Brandon talked near the counter, both of them gesturing with the animation that came when they discussed business together. I sat in my truck for an extra minute, gathering courage, before I grabbed my sample case and walked toward the door that would either finally open or close forever. I walked through the front door carrying that sample case like it held something more precious than empty bottles and business cards. The kitchen noise hit me immediately, the familiar sound of my family existing in their well-established rhythm. Brandon was mid-story about some client lunch where he'd apparently secured a commercial lease agreement that would net my father's company a significant commission. My father listened with the kind of focused attention I'd spent years trying to earn, asking follow-up questions about square footage and tenant improvements and projected return timelines. My mother moved around them both, setting out plates and refilling water glasses, orchestrating the dinner setup with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing this household dynamic for decades. She glanced up when I entered, offered that same tight smile from this morning, and asked if I was hungry. Not how the expo went. Not whether anything significant had happened. Just the basic courtesy question that required nothing from her except a yes or no answer. I set my case down by the door, trying to find my way into the conversation. The words felt huge in my throat, almost too big to speak. Brandon finished his story with a flourish about how the client had specifically requested to work with him again on future properties, and my father clapped him on the shoulder with genuine pride radiating from every part of his posture. That gesture said everything about who belonged in this family's version of success, and who was still waiting outside the circle. "How was your thing today?" Brandon asked, finally acknowledging my presence. He said it casually, almost kindly, but something about the word thing made it clear he wasn't actually asking. He was performing politeness while already dismissing whatever answer I might give. "The expo was good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Really good, actually. Something significant happened." My father looked up from his conversation then, not with curiosity exactly, but with the wary expression he got whenever I tried to insert my projects into family discussions. Like he was bracing himself to hear about another farmer's market contact or small store placement that he'd have to pretend to find impressive while internally cataloging all the ways it didn't measure up to real business. "I met with a buyer today," I continued, feeling the weight of what I was about to say press against my ribs. "A regional buyer from Walmart. She wants to schedule a meeting in Bentonville next week to discuss stocking Ember and Oak in 50 Texas stores for a trial run. If it performs well, it could expand to regional or even national distribution." The silence that followed wasn't the shocked, congratulatory kind I'd half imagined during the drive home. It was something colder, something that felt like calculation. My father set down the document he'd been holding, and my mother stopped mid-motion with a serving spoon suspended over a bowl of salad. Brandon's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that looked uncomfortably close to concern. "Walmart approached you?" my father asked, and the skepticism in his voice was so familiar it almost felt comfortable. "At a small business expo? For a product you make in a garage?" "Yes," I said, holding my ground even though my hands wanted to shake. "Jennifer Walsh is her name. She's scouting Texas artisan products for their local producer program. She tasted the Chipotle blend, asked about production capacity, and said it's exactly what they're looking for." My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in the posture that meant he was about to explain reality to someone who didn't understand how things actually worked. "Tyler, these big retailers do this kind of thing all the time. They scout small producers, get them excited about possibilities, then bury them in requirements and fees that make it impossible to actually fulfill the orders. It's a way to test market interest without committing to anything real." "She gave me her direct contact information," I said, pulling out my phone to show the business card photo I'd saved. "She took samples. She specified next week for the meeting and outlined what documentation I'd need to bring." Brandon jumped in then, his tone gentler than our father's but somehow more cutting. "I'm not trying to rain on this, Tyler, but you have to think about the logistics. Walmart orders would require production capacity you don't have. You'd need commercial kitchen certification, liability insurance at a level you probably can't afford, consistent supply chains for ingredients. Even if this buyer is serious, you're not equipped to handle what they'd require." My mother finally spoke, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and caution she used whenever she wanted to discourage something while pretending to be supportive. "Maybe you should talk to a lawyer before that meeting, honey. Make sure you understand what you'd be getting into. These big companies can be very demanding, and if you can't deliver what they expect, it could hurt your reputation with the smaller clients you already have." I stood there holding my phone, feeling the moment I'd been so excited to share dissolving into something that felt like failure even though nothing had actually failed yet. They weren't celebrating with me. They were already constructing the narrative of why this wouldn't work, building the framework of my inevitable disappointment before I'd even tried to make it happen. "I know it's a big jump," I said, hearing the defensiveness creep into my voice and hating it, "but this is what I've been working toward. This is the break that could turn Ember and Oak into something sustainable." My father stood up then, moving to the counter where he poured himself a glass of water with deliberate slowness. When he turned back to face me, his expression had shifted into something I recognized too well. The look he got when he was about to deliver hard truth to someone who needed to hear it. "Tyler, I'm going to be direct with you because someone needs to be. You've spent 2 years playing at entrepreneurship, and I've let it go because I thought you'd eventually realize this wasn't a real path forward. But this Walmart thing, if it's even legitimate, is going to expose every weakness in what you've built. You don't have the infrastructure, the capital, or frankly the business experience to handle a contract like that. And when it falls apart, and it will fall apart, you're going to be 30 years old with nothing to show for the time you've wasted except debt and a failed hobby business." The words landed like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the exact places I was already vulnerable. But what made it worse was the way he said it, with that calm certainty like he was simply describing weather patterns instead of dismantling my future. "What I think you should do," he continued, setting his water glass down with a soft clink that somehow sounded final, "is email this buyer and politely decline. Thank her for the interest, explain that you're not in a position to scale up right now, and use this experience as a signal that it's time to transition into something more stable. My company is expanding the property management division. I could bring you in at a junior level, teach you the business properly, give you a foundation that actually leads somewhere." Brandon nodded along, jumping in to support the narrative. "That's actually solid advice, Tyler. You could keep making your hot sauce as a side thing, sell it at markets on weekends if you want, but have a real career as your primary focus. That way you're not putting all your eggs in a basket that's probably going to break." I looked at my mother, some small part of me still hoping she'd push back, that she'd tell them to let me try, that she'd see this moment for what it actually was, an opportunity instead of a guaranteed disaster. But she just arranged silverware on the table, her silence speaking louder than any words could have. "I'm taking the meeting," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I'm going to Bentonville next week, and I'm going to explore what this could become." My father's expression hardened, the warmth he'd shown Brandon earlier completely absent now. "Then you're making a mistake. And when it blows up in your face, don't come asking for money to clean up the mess. You want to learn this lesson the hard way, that's your choice. But I'm not funding your failure." He left the kitchen then, walking toward his office with the heavy footsteps that signaled a conversation was over whether I wanted it to be or not. Brandon lingered for a moment, shaking his head like I was a lost cause he'd tried to help, before following our father down the hallway. My mother finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't encouragement or even disappointment. It was resignation, like she'd already accepted that I was going to crash, and was just waiting to see how bad the damage would be. "Dinner's ready if you want to eat," she said quietly, and went back to setting the table for a meal I suddenly had no appetite for. I picked up my sample case and walked back out to my truck, sitting in the driveway as the sky finished darkening and the house glowed behind me with a warmth I wasn't part of. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan asking how it went, if my family was celebrating, if they were as excited as we were. I stared at that message for a long time before typing back a simple lie. Told them. It went fine. The truth was too complicated to explain in a text message. The truth was that I'd just been offered the biggest opportunity of my life, and the people who were supposed to be proud of me had spent 15 minutes explaining why I was going to fail. The truth was that I was sitting in my truck outside my childhood home feeling more alone than I'd felt at 4:30 that morning in a cold garage. I started the engine and drove back toward East Austin, toward the tiny apartment and the garage workspace that suddenly felt more like home than the house I'd grown up in. The streets were quieter now, the evening traffic thinned out to just the people heading home after long days, and I let myself imagine what it would feel like to prove them all wrong. To walk into a Walmart in 6 months and see my bottles on the shelf, my label, my recipe that I'd developed in that garage they all dismissed as the sight of a fantasy. But underneath that imagining was something darker, something that whispered in my father's voice. What if he was right? What if I didn't have what it took to scale up, to handle the demands of a retailer like Walmart, to transform a farmer's market side project into a legitimate business? What if this was just going to be an expensive public way to prove that he'd understood my limitations better than I understood my own potential? I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the parking lot, trying to push those thoughts away. My phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. I opened it without thinking, and my stomach dropped when I saw the sender. It was from my father, sent from his business email account with a subject line that just said reality check. The email was short, clinical, stripped of anything that might resemble paternal warmth. He'd attached a spreadsheet breaking down projected costs for commercial kitchen certification, increased liability insurance, ingredient sourcing at scale, packaging materials, warehousing, distribution logistics, and legal fees for contract review. The bottom line number was over $75,000 in upfront costs before a single bottle would ship to Walmart. Below the spreadsheet, he'd written a single paragraph. I put this together so you can see what you're actually facing. This isn't negativity, it's math. You don't have this kind of capital, and no bank is going to loan it to someone with your limited business history. I'm telling you this because I don't want to watch you destroy yourself chasing something that was never realistic. Sometimes being a parent means stopping your kid from walking off a cliff, even when they're convinced they can fly. Think seriously about my offer. The property management position is real, and it's still available if you're ready to be sensible. I sat there reading that email 3 times, feeling each word settle into my chest like stones. He'd spent the time since I left the house building a case against me, documenting all the reasons I was going to fail, converting my hope into a spreadsheet that proved his point. And the worst part was that he wasn't wrong about the costs. Scaling up would require capital I didn't have, infrastructure I hadn't built, systems I'd need to learn while trying not to drown. But something else was rising up underneath the fear, something that tasted like anger and defiance, and the memory of every time he told me I couldn't do something before I'd even tried. I thought about that culinary school acceptance letter, disappearing into Brandon's graduate fund. I thought about 2 years of farmers markets where people had connected with what I'd made, where the product had spoken for itself without needing his approval or his spreadsheet. I forwarded the email to Jordan with a message that just said, "This is what I'm dealing with." Then I opened a new browser tab and started researching small business loans, commercial kitchen rental spaces, and production scaling strategies for food startups. If my father wanted to document why I'd fail, I could document how I'd succeed. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh was in 6 days, and I wasn't going to walk in unprepared. The next morning came too early, my alarm cutting through a restless sleep full of dreams about breaking bottles and business meetings I arrived at without any product to show. I went through my routine automatically, making coffee, reviewing my notes for the Walmart meeting, trying to ignore the way my father's email had lodged itself in my brain like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. My phone rang just after 7, Jordan's name flashing across the screen. I answered, and their voice came through bright and determined, cutting through the fog of doubt I'd been sitting in since dinner. "I've been up since 5 researching production loans for food startups," they said without preamble. "There are specialized lenders who work specifically with artisan producers scaling up for major retail contracts. The interest rates aren't great, but they're possible. And I found a commercial kitchen space in Pflugerville that does flexible rental agreements. We can tour it this afternoon if you're free." The "we" in that sentence made my throat tight. Jordan had been with me from the beginning, had believed in Ember and Oak when it was just an idea and a pile of peppers in my apartment, had stayed up late helping me design labels and price products and figure out farmers market logistics. They'd never once asked what they'd get out of it, never treated my dream like it was optional or disposable. "I got an email from my father last night," I said, and heard my voice crack slightly on the words. "He made a spreadsheet of everything that could go wrong, and why I should give up." Jordan was quiet for a moment, and when they spoke again, their voice carried a particular kind of fury that only comes from watching someone you care about get systematically diminished. "Your father has spent your whole life being wrong about you. He was wrong when he said you couldn't build a business, wrong when he said nobody would buy your product, wrong when he said the farmers markets were a waste of time. He's wrong now. And the only way to prove that is to show up to Bentonville with a real plan and the guts to execute it." "What if the plan falls apart?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been eating at me since I read that spreadsheet. "What if I get the contract and can't deliver?" "Then you'll figure it out," Jordan said simply. "That's what entrepreneurs do. They figure it out when everyone says it's impossible. Your father builds his life on certainty and control. You're building yours on possibility and risk. Those are different muscles, and his don't work for what you're trying to do." We spent the next hour on the phone going through logistics, making lists, identifying the gaps between where I was and where I needed to be. By the time we hung up, the fear hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more useful. Determination mixed with terror, the exact combination that had gotten me this far. I spent the day making calls, scheduling tours, researching costs and timelines. The commercial kitchen Jordan found was available for a site visit at 3, so I drove out to Pflugerville with my notebook full of questions and my father's spreadsheet printed out as a challenge I intended to answer line by line. The kitchen was bigger than I expected, stainless steel everywhere, industrial equipment that made my garage setup look like a child's play kitchen. The owner, a woman named Patricia who'd built the space specifically for small food producers trying to scale up, walked me through the capacity, the certification status, the hourly rental rates that made my palms sweat. "What kind of volume are you looking at?" she asked, and I told her about Walmart, about the 50-store trial, about the possibility of regional expansion if things went well. She didn't look surprised or skeptical. She just nodded and started talking about production schedules, ingredient storage, the other producers who rented space here, and how they coordinated around each other's needs. She treated my business like it was real, like scaling up was a logistics problem to solve rather than a fantasy to dismiss. "I've seen a lot of producers come through here," Patricia said as we finished the tour. "The ones who make it aren't always the ones with the most capital or the fanciest business plans. They're the ones who refuse to quit when it gets hard, who solve problems instead of surrendering to them. You've got that look about you like you're here to build something that matters." I signed a preliminary rental agreement before I left, committing to 20 hours of kitchen time per week starting the following month. The cost made my stomach hurt, but it was less than my father's spreadsheet had projected, and Patricia had mentioned other grants and small business resources I hadn't known existed. On the drive back to Austin, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice came through, professional and slightly rushed, introducing himself as Marcus Webb from the Texas Food Producers Association. He said Jennifer Walsh had reached out to their network asking about Tyler Bennett and Ember and Oak, doing her due diligence before the Bentonville meeting. My heart started hammering. This was real. She wasn't just being polite at an expo. She was actively researching me, vetting whether I was worth the risk. I wanted to give you a heads up, Marcus continued, that she specifically asked about your production history, your consistency, and your character. I've seen your work at the farmers markets, tasted your product, watched you build this thing from nothing. I told her you're the real deal, that you've got both the quality and the work ethic to handle a contract like this. But I also wanted to tell you directly that if you're serious about scaling up, you need to be prepared for how demanding Walmart can be. They're not going to hold your hand, and if you miss delivery windows or quality standards, they'll drop you without hesitation. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I'm working on infrastructure now. Commercial kitchen rentals, supply chain logistics, all of it. Good, Marcus said. Because Jennifer doesn't waste time on producers she doesn't believe in. If she's taking you to Bentonville, it means she sees something. Don't make her regret it. The call ended, and I sat at a red light feeling the full weight of what I was stepping into. This wasn't just about proving my father wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could handle something this big, that I was capable of transforming a garage project into a legitimate business that could hold its own in a major retail environment. I pulled into my apartment complex just as the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that felt almost too beautiful for how anxious I felt. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother, asking if I'd thought more about what my father said, suggesting we could all sit down and talk through options rationally. I didn't respond. There was nothing rational to discuss. Either I was going to pursue this opportunity with everything I had, or I was going to fold under the pressure of their certainty that I'd fail. And folding wasn't an option anymore. Not after Jennifer Walsh had vetted me with industry contacts, not after Patricia had looked at my business like it was worth investing in, not after Jordan had spent hours researching ways to make this possible. I spent the next 3 days moving through a blur of preparation that left me exhausted and wired at the same time. Every morning started before dawn in my garage, bottling the last of my current inventory while simultaneously planning for production levels I'd never attempted. Jordan came over each evening after their shift, and we'd spread paperwork across my kitchen table, building the business plan I'd need to present in Bentonville. Cash flow projections, ingredient sourcing contracts, quality control protocols, everything Jennifer Walsh might ask about when she stopped being impressed by the flavor and started evaluating whether I could actually deliver. The commercial kitchen in Pflugerville had given me access to their equipment list and certification documents, which helped flesh out the production capacity section of my plan. I'd connected with 3 different pepper suppliers who could guarantee consistent volume and quality, something I'd never needed when I was just filling farmers' market tables. Everything was coming together in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying, like building a ladder toward something I couldn't quite see but knew I had to reach. My family had gone quiet after that dinner conversation, which somehow felt worse than active opposition. No more emails from my father documenting my inevitable failure. No more concerned texts from my mother suggesting I reconsider. Just silence, like they'd already decided I was going to crash, and were simply waiting for the wreckage to confirm what they already knew. Brandon had posted on social media about closing another major deal, and my mother had commented with 3 celebration emojis and a note about how proud she was. My own post about the expo, buried 2 days back in my feed, had gotten a handful of likes from friends and exactly 0 engagement from anyone in my family. On Thursday morning, 2 days before my flight to Bentonville, I drove to my parents' house to pick up some old business textbooks I'd left in the garage. I'd remembered a chapter on retail negotiations that might be useful, and I needed every advantage I could gather. The driveway was empty except for my mother's car, which meant my father and Brandon were both at the office. I felt relieved and disappointed at the same time, glad to avoid another confrontation but still carrying some small hope that my father might have softened, might have reconsidered his certainty about my failure. I let myself in through the side door, calling out to let my mother know I was there. She appeared from the living room looking slightly startled, like she hadn't expected me to actually show up at the house anymore. We stood in the kitchen where I'd announced the Walmart meeting just days earlier, and the air between us felt thick with everything we weren't saying. "I'm just grabbing some books from the garage," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'll be out of your way in a minute." She nodded, then surprised me by speaking. "Your father's not handling this well, you know. He thinks you're being reckless, and it's hard for him to watch you make choices he believes are going to hurt you." I turned to face her fully, feeling something sharp rising in my chest. He's not watching me make choices. He's decided what the outcome will be before I've even tried. There's a difference between caring about someone's well-being and actively rooting for them to fail so you can be right. My mother's face tightened, that familiar expression she got whenever someone suggested my father's motives might be less than pure. "He's not rooting for you to fail, Tyler. He's trying to protect you from disappointment. You don't understand how hard it is for him to see you struggle with something that could be avoided if you just listen to his experience." "His experience in real estate development," I said, hearing my voice rise despite my efforts to stay calm. "Not in food production, not in artisan manufacturing, not in building a business from the ground up without family money or connections. He's using his playbook for my game, and when I don't follow his rules, he decides I'm the problem." She looked away, adjusting a dish towel that was already perfectly straight on the counter. "Brandon listens to his advice. Brandon's doing very well." And there it was, the comparison that had been humming underneath every conversation my entire life. Brandon, who'd followed the approved path, who'd joined the family business, who'd become the son our father could brag about at industry events. And me, the one who'd insisted on doing things differently, on building something my father didn't design or control or understand. "Brandon got a funded graduate degree and a down payment on his first property," I said quietly. "I got my culinary school money redirected without anyone asking if that's what I wanted. We're not playing the same game, Mom. We never have been. And you've been pretending not to notice that for years." Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually engage with what I'd said, might acknowledge the inequality she'd been enabling. But instead she took a breath and reset her expression into something neutral and distant. "I think you should get your books and go. I don't want to argue with you." I found the textbooks in the garage, buried under old camping equipment and boxes of Brandon's college awards that were apparently worth saving while my own achievements lived in my apartment where nobody had to see them. I carried them to my truck and my mother didn't come out to say goodbye. I drove away from that house feeling something I'd been trying not to feel for a long time. Not anger exactly, but a deep exhaustion with the effort it took to keep hoping they'd eventually see me clearly. Jordan called while I was sitting at a coffee shop trying to review the negotiation chapter I'd needed those textbooks for. Their voice came through tense and urgent in a way that made my stomach drop. "I just got a weird message," they said. "Someone claiming to be from Walmart, asking questions about you and Ember and Oak. But something felt off about it. They were asking things that didn't sound like normal vetting, more like they were fishing for problems." My mind immediately went to my father, to the email he'd sent with the spreadsheet, to the way he'd gone silent after I'd refused his offer. What kind of questions? About your reliability, your financial stability, whether you'd had any business conflicts or disputes. The person said they were doing background verification for vendor onboarding, but when I asked for their direct contact to verify, they got vague and hung up. I tried calling the number back, and it went straight to a generic voicemail. Ice spread through my veins. "You think someone's trying to sabotage this? I think someone wants information they can use to make you look bad," Jordan said carefully. "And I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that resistance isn't just coming from inside your house anymore." I sat there staring at my laptop screen, the negotiation strategies blurring into meaningless words. My father had access to business networks, industry contacts, ways of making inquiries that would sound legitimate, even if their intent was destructive. I didn't want to believe he'd actively sabotage my opportunity with Walmart, but I also couldn't ignore the pattern of behavior that had defined my entire relationship with him. When I didn't follow his path, he didn't just disapprove. He intervened. "What do I do?" I asked, hearing the tremor in my voice and hating it. "You document everything," Jordan said firmly. "Screenshot that call log, write down exactly what was asked and when. And you get ahead of this by reaching out to Jennifer Walsh directly. Tell her you've been informed that someone's been making inquiries claiming to represent Walmart, And you want to verify any official background check processes so you can respond appropriately. That way, if someone is trying to plant doubts, you're already on record as being transparent and proactive. I drafted the email to Jennifer right there in the coffee shop, my hands shaking slightly as I typed. I kept it professional and straightforward, mentioning Jordan's contact, the suspicious inquiry, my desire to ensure I was engaging properly with any official verification processes. I hit send before I could second-guess the wording, then sat back feeling like I just stepped into a wider battle than I'd understood I was fighting. Jennifer responded within 2 hours, her email direct and slightly concerned. She confirmed that Walmart did conduct background verification for new vendors, but it was always done through their official corporate compliance team with clear identification and formal documentation. Anyone calling without those credentials was not representing the company, and she appreciated me flagging the issue. She'd noted it in my file and suggested I forward any future suspicious contacts directly to her. The relief was immediate but incomplete. Someone had tried to gather information they could use against me, and while I couldn't prove it was my father, the timing felt too precise to be coincidental. I forwarded Jennifer's response to Jordan, then sat in that coffee shop watching people come and go with their normal problems, their regular lives that didn't include family members actively working to destroy their opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Dad wants to know if you've come to your senses yet about Bentonville. He's worried you're going to embarrass yourself and waste money on a trip that's not going anywhere. Maybe you could at least let him review your business plan before you present it. He's got experience with corporate negotiations that might help. I stared at that message for a long time, parsing the layers of manipulation wrapped in concern. The implication that I was being irrational, the suggestion that my plan needed his oversight to be legitimate, the assumption that I'd fail without his intervention. And underneath it all, the request for access to my business plan, the exact document that would give him detailed information about my strategies, my suppliers, my projected costs, everything he'd need to identify vulnerabilities he could exploit. I typed back a single sentence. Thanks, but I've got it covered. Then I blocked my father's business email and set my phone to filter texts from my family to a separate folder I'd check once a day. If I was going to do this, I needed to protect my focus from the constant undermining that passed for concern in my household. Friday morning arrived with overcast skies that matched my mood. I had one day left before flying to Arkansas, and my preparation felt both thorough and completely inadequate. I'd rehearsed my presentation until I could recite it in my sleep, had backup documents for every claim I planned to make, had even bought a new shirt that Jordan insisted made me look like someone who ran a serious business. But underneath all that preparation was a whisper of doubt that sounded suspiciously like my father's voice, asking what made me think I was ready for this, reminding me of every time I'd aimed high and fallen short. I drove out to the Pflugerville kitchen to do a test run of scaled-up production, wanting to prove to myself that I could handle increased volume before I promised anything to Walmart. Patricia had arranged for me to have 4 hours of dedicated space, and I'd brought enough ingredients to produce 200 bottles, more than double my usual farmer's market batch. The work was intense and methodical, requiring focus that left no room for anxiety about family dynamics or suspicious phone calls. I moved through the prep stations with growing confidence, the industrial equipment responding smoothly to the recipes I'd developed in my garage. By hour 3, I had 150 bottles filled and cooling, the production line humming with an efficiency that made something tight in my chest finally loosen. Patricia stopped by to check on my progress, nodding approvingly at the organized chaos I'd created. "You've got good instincts for this," she said, scanning the rows of filled bottles. "A lot of first-timers panic when they scale up, try to control every detail and end up bottlenecking themselves. You're letting the process work." "I'm terrified I'm going to mess something up," I admitted, wiping sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. She laughed, not unkindly. "That's how you know you're taking it seriously. The ones who should be terrified are usually too confident to see the risks. You're going to be fine. More than fine, actually, if you keep working like this." I finished the production run with 10 minutes to spare, 187 bottles of Chipotle blend that tasted exactly like my farmer's market batches. Proof that scaling up was possible, that my recipes could survive increased volume, that maybe I wasn't as unprepared for Walmart as my father insisted I was. On the drive back to Austin, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, still wary after Jordan's warning about suspicious inquiries, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice came through, warm and slightly amused, introducing herself as Diana Pacheco from the Austin Business Journal. I'm writing a feature on local food producers who are scaling up to major retail contracts, she said. Jennifer Walsh mentioned your story when I reached out to Walmart for leads. She said you're meeting with them this weekend about a potential trial run. I'd love to interview you for the piece, get your perspective on what it's like to go from farmers markets to corporate retail. My first instinct was to say no, to keep this quiet until I knew whether the Walmart deal would actually happen. But then I thought about my father's spreadsheet, about the suspicious phone call, about every time I'd been told to stay small and invisible. Maybe visibility was exactly what I needed, documentation that this was real, that people outside my family could see what I was building. I'd be happy to talk, I said, surprising myself. When did you want to do the interview? We scheduled it for later that afternoon at a cafe downtown. Diana showed up with a recorder and a notebook, asking questions that felt genuinely interested rather than skeptical. She wanted to know about my process, my inspiration, what made Ember and Oak different from other artisan hot sauces flooding the market. I found myself talking about the oak smoking technique, the locally sourced peppers, the balance between heat and complexity that kept customers coming back. What does your family think about all this? She asked, and something in my expression must have shifted because she leaned forward slightly. That's a complicated question, I'm guessing? My father thinks I'm wasting my time, I said, then immediately wondered if I should have been more diplomatic. But Diana just nodded like she'd heard this story before. Let me guess, she said. He's successful in a traditional business field, wants you to follow a proven path, doesn't understand why you choose risk over security? That's pretty much it, I said. Plus he's got a son who did follow that path and is doing well. I'm the one who insists on doing things differently, which apparently means I'm either reckless or naive, depending on his mood. Diana made notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. You know what I've learned covering small business stories for 5 years? The entrepreneurs who succeed aren't usually the ones with the most family support. They're the ones who build it anyway, who find their validation in the work instead of waiting for permission from people who'll never give it. Your father might come around eventually or he might not. But either way, you're building something real, and that's what matters. The interview lasted an hour, and by the end I felt lighter somehow, like speaking the truth out loud to someone who understood had released pressure I didn't know I'd been carrying. Diana said the piece would run in the next week's edition, contingent on how the Walmart meeting went, and she'd check in afterward for any updates. I walked back to my truck feeling strange and exposed, like I just made my struggle public in a way I couldn't take back. But underneath that vulnerability was something else, a sense that maybe I was done protecting my family's comfort at the expense of my own truth. They told me I was going to fail so many times I'd started to believe the only way forward was to prove them wrong quietly, to succeed without making them uncomfortable. But what if I succeeded loudly instead? What if I let the world see what I was building regardless of whether my father approved? That evening Jordan came over with takeout and a pep talk, both of which I desperately needed. We sat on my apartment floor surrounded by all the documents I'd be bringing to Bentonville, doing one final review of everything I might be asked. You ready for this? Jordan asked, watching me sort papers into folders with slightly obsessive precision. No, I said honestly. But I'm going anyway, which I guess is what matters. Jordan grinned. That's exactly what matters. Your father's betting on you to fold, to decide this is too hard and come crawling back to his company. The best thing you can do is show up in Arkansas tomorrow and negotiate like you deserve to be there. What if I don't deserve to be there? The question slipped out before I could stop it, exposing the fear I'd been trying to bury under preparation and determination. Jordan set down their food and looked at me with an intensity that made me meet their eyes. Jennifer Walsh doesn't invite people to Bentonville as a courtesy. She invites them because they've got something worth her time and Walmart's investment. You've spent 2 years building a product people love, perfecting recipes, showing up to farmers markets in weather that would make most people quit. You've earned this meeting. Now you just have to walk in there and believe what everyone except your family already sees. You're the real deal, Tyler. Start acting like it. I flew out to Bentonville early Saturday morning, my carry-on stuffed with samples, documents, and the kind of nervous energy that made sleep impossible on the 2-hour flight. The Walmart headquarters loomed enormous when my rental car pulled into the campus, all glass and corporate efficiency that made my garage operation feel impossibly small in comparison. But I thought about Patricia's Kitchen, about the 187 bottles I produced in 4 hours, about Diana Pacheco thinking my story was worth writing about. I wasn't as small as I felt. I just needed to remember that when I walked through those doors. Jennifer Walsh met me in the lobby exactly on time, her handshake firm and her smile professional but warm. She led me through security, down hallways lined with vendor success stories and photographs of products that had started small and grown into national brands. Each image felt like both inspiration and intimidation, proof that what I was attempting was possible, but also evidence of how far I'd have to climb. The conference room was smaller than I expected, just a table and chairs and a screen for presentations. Jennifer sat across from me with a tablet and a calm expression that gave nothing away. She asked me to walk through my business history, my production capabilities, my vision for growth. I talked for 20 minutes, my voice steadier than I expected, covering everything Jordan and I had rehearsed while also letting my genuine passion for the product come through. When I finished, Jennifer nodded slowly, making notes on her tablet. "Your product is strong," she said. "The flavor profile is exactly what we're looking for in our Texas artisan line. But I need to be direct with you about concerns. You're currently a one-person operation working out of rented kitchen space. Walmart moves volume that could overwhelm your capacity quickly. If we do a 50-store trial and it performs well, you'd need to scale up to potentially 500 stores within 6 months. Can you handle that kind of growth?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with all the weight of what I was actually being asked. Jennifer wasn't wondering if I had dreams or passion or a good recipe. She was asking if I had the infrastructure, the capital, the operational backbone to deliver on a promise that would either make or break everything I'd built. I thought about my father's spreadsheet, about the $75,000 figure he'd calculated to prove this was impossible. I thought about the suspicious phone call to Jordan, about the way my family had gone silent after I'd refused to give up. Then I thought about Patricia's Kitchen, about the suppliers who'd agreed to scale with me, about the business plan Jordan and I had built together in my tiny apartment. I looked Jennifer Walsh directly in the eye and made a choice to believe in what I'd built instead of what I'd been told I couldn't do. "I can handle it," I said, and my voice didn't waver. "I've already secured rental agreements with a commercial kitchen that has the capacity for the volume you're describing. I've established relationships with 3 pepper suppliers who can guarantee consistent quality and increased volume. I've mapped out production schedules that would allow me to meet delivery windows for 500 stores while maintaining the quality standards that made you interested in the first place. I'm not saying it won't be challenging, but I've built my business on solving problems that looked impossible until I figured out how to make them work." Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval crossing her face. "Walk me through your supply chain. I want specifics on ingredient sourcing, production timelines, quality control protocols." I spent the next 40 minutes going through every detail of the plan Jordan and I had constructed. I showed her the contracts with pepper suppliers, the certification documents from Patricia's Kitchen, the projected production schedules broken down by week. I explained my quality control system, the testing procedures I'd developed to ensure consistency across batches, the backup plans I'd created for equipment failures or ingredient shortages. With every answer, I watched Jennifer's skepticism transform into something more concrete. She wasn't just listening anymore. She was evaluating me as a genuine vendor, someone who'd done the homework required to play in this space. When I pulled out samples of 3 different production batches, all identical in flavor and heat level, she tasted each one carefully and made notes about the consistency. "This is more thorough than I expected," she said finally, setting down the last sample bottle. "Most small producers come in here with passion and recipes, but no real understanding of operational requirements. You've clearly thought through the logistics." "I had help," I admitted. "A friend who believed in this when nobody else did. They pushed me to think bigger than farmers markets, to build infrastructure before I needed it so I'd be ready when opportunities came." Jennifer nodded, making more notes on her tablet. "That kind of foresight matters. Walmart partnership isn't just about having a good product. It's about being a reliable partner who can scale with our needs and maintain standards under pressure. A lot of small producers can't handle that transition. They either drown in the volume or cut corners trying to keep up, and we end up terminating contracts that could have worked if they'd been better prepared. She pulled up a document on the screen behind her, and I recognized the format immediately. It was a vendor agreement, the kind of contract that would either launch Ember and Oak into a completely different category of business or expose every weakness my father had been so certain existed. "I'm prepared to offer you a trial contract," Jennifer said, and the words sent electricity through every nerve in my body. 50 Texas stores, 3-month trial period, with performance reviews at 30 and 60 days. If your sell-through rates meet our benchmarks and you maintain delivery schedules without quality issues, we'll expand to 200 stores in the Southwest region. If that expansion performs well for another 3 months, we'd look at national distribution. She slid a folder across the table, thick with paperwork that represented everything I'd been working toward. "This is a standard vendor agreement with terms specific to your product category. You'll want to have a lawyer review it before signing, but the key points are delivery schedules, quality standards, pricing structure, and termination clauses. The initial order would be for 10,000 units delivered over 8 weeks. After that, we'd move to a rolling inventory system based on store performance data." 10,000 units. The number was so far beyond anything I produced that for a moment I couldn't process it. My biggest production run had been 187 bottles. Jennifer was talking about scaling up by a factor of 50, maintaining quality and consistency across a volume I'd never attempted. "I know this is a big jump," Jennifer continued, reading my expression accurately. "That's why we build in the trial period. We want you to succeed, Tyler. We don't offer these opportunities to fail. But you need to be realistic about what you're taking on. The first few months will be the hardest thing you've ever done. You'll work hours that feel impossible, solve problems you didn't know existed, and push your operation to its absolute limits. If you're not prepared for that level of intensity, it's better to acknowledge it now than to sign this contract and discover 3 weeks in that you can't deliver." I picked up the folder, feeling the weight of all those pages, all those terms and conditions that would define the next phase of my life. My hands wanted to shake, but I steadied them, refusing to show uncertainty even though my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "When do you need my answer?" I asked. "Take the weekend to review with legal counsel," Jennifer said. "I need a signed contract by Wednesday if we're going to hit our inventory timelines for the trial launch. That gives you 4 days to make sure this is really what you want." We shook hands and she walked me back through those hallways lined with success stories that suddenly felt less like intimidation and more like possibility. In the rental car, I sat in the parking lot staring at that folder, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Jennifer Walsh had offered me a contract. Walmart wanted to stock Ember and Oak. The thing my father had been so certain was a fantasy had just become an actual choice I had to make. I called Jordan before I even left the parking lot, and they answered on the first ring like they'd been waiting by the phone. "How did it go?" they demanded, and I could hear the tension in their voice. "She offered me a contract," I said, and saying it out loud made it feel real in a way it hadn't while I was sitting in that conference room. 10,000 units over 8 weeks for a 50-store trial. If it performs well, expansion to 200 stores, and if that works, potential national distribution. Jordan screamed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. When they finally stopped celebrating, their voice came through thick with emotion. "I knew it. I knew she saw what you'd built. Did you sign it?" "She wants me to have a lawyer review it first, get back to her by Wednesday. The volume is intense, Jordan. 10,000 bottles in 8 weeks. That's more than I've produced in 2 years combined." "You can do it," Jordan said with absolute certainty. "We can do it. I'll take time off work if I need to. We'll figure out the production schedule, hire help if we have to, whatever it takes. This is happening, Tyler. Your business is actually happening." I drove to the airport in a daze, the contract folder sitting on the passenger seat like it might disappear if I looked away too long. The flight back to Austin felt different than the flight out, the same airplane and route transformed by what I was carrying with me. I kept pulling out my phone to text someone, to share this news with people who should care. And every time I opened my messages, I'd see my family's names and put the phone away again. By the time I landed in Austin, it was almost 8 at night. Jordan had texted coordinates for a bar in East Austin, where they were waiting with 2 other friends who'd supported Ember and Oak from the beginning. I walked in to find them at a corner table with a bottle of champagne already open, and the moment they saw me, Jordan stood up and pulled me into a hug that felt like it might crack my ribs. "To Tyler and Ember and Oak," Jordan announced, raising a glass. "About to be stocked in 50 Walmart stores because some people know how to build something real instead of just talking about it." We toasted and drank, and for a few hours I let myself exist in that celebration, in the company of people who'd believed in me when belief was the only currency I had. But underneath the champagne and laughter was a growing awareness that I'd have to tell my family eventually, that this news would force a confrontation I'd been avoiding since the moment my father slammed those bottles against the garage floor. I drove home around midnight, the Austin streets quiet and the contract folder sitting on my passenger seat like unfinished business. My apartment felt different when I walked in, like the space itself had changed now that I was standing on the edge of something so much bigger than farmers markets and garage production. I set the folder on my kitchen table and just stared at it, trying to wrap my mind around what signing those papers would mean. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, the first direct contact since I'd left to pick up those textbooks. "Your father heard through the business network that you were in Bentonville this weekend. He wants to know if you're ready to talk sensibly yet." I stared at that message, parsing the layers of control and dismissal packed into 2 sentences. He'd heard through the network, which meant he'd been tracking me, keeping tabs on my movements through whatever contacts he had at Walmart or in the food industry. And he still thought I was the one being unreasonable, that sensible meant abandoning my business and accepting his vision of my future. I typed back before I could overthink it. "Had my meeting with Jennifer Walsh. She offered me a contract for a 50-store trial with potential for national expansion. I'll be signing it on Wednesday." The response came back within seconds. "We need to talk before you sign anything. Don't make a decision you'll regret. I'm serious, Tyler." I turned off my phone and went to bed, but sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark thinking about that contract, about 10,000 bottles and delivery schedules, and all the ways this could either transform my life or prove every doubt my father had ever voiced. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went back to the kitchen table, pulling out the contract and reading through it page by page. The terms were clear and demanding. Strict delivery windows with financial penalties for late shipments. Quality standards that require batch testing and certification. Pricing structures that would squeeze my margins thin until volume made up the difference. Insurance requirements that would cost more than I'd budgeted. It was everything my father's spreadsheet had warned about and more, laid out in legal language that made the risks impossible to ignore. But it was also real. It was Walmart saying my product was worth their shelf space, worth the investment of launching a trial program, worth the risk of bringing an unknown producer into their supply chain. Every scary clause was also proof that I'd built something legitimate enough to warrant a corporate contract instead of a handshake agreement at a farmer's market. Sunday morning arrived with bright sunshine that felt aggressively cheerful given how little I'd slept. I made coffee and called the lawyer Patricia had recommended, leaving a message about needing urgent contract review. Then I texted Jordan asking if they'd be willing to help me map out a production schedule that could actually hit 10,000 units in 8 weeks. Jordan showed up an hour later with their laptop and a determination that matched my anxiety. We spread out across my living room floor with calendar apps and spreadsheets and ingredient calculators, breaking down the seemingly impossible number into daily production targets. "If we can produce 250 bottles per day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks, that's 10,000 units, Jordan said, typing numbers into a spreadsheet. "Patricia's Kitchen can handle that volume if you book enough hours. You'd need to hire at least 2 people to help with production, maybe 3 to be safe." "The startup costs," I said, voicing the fear that had been growing since I'd read through the contract. "Equipment, ingredients at volume, hiring people, increased insurance, legal fees for contract review. I'm looking at maybe $30,000 before I produce a single bottle for Walmart." Jordan nodded slowly. "That's less than half what your father projected. You've already cut the costs by being smart about infrastructure. But yeah, you're going to need capital. What about a small business loan?" I'd been researching loans all week, had applications half filled out on 3 different lender websites, but the reality of actually taking on that debt made my stomach tight. If the trial fails, I'll be $30,000 in debt with nothing to show for it. That's what my father keeps saying, that I'm risking everything on something that's probably not going to work. And if the trial succeeds, Jordan countered, you'll have a Walmart contract and a legitimate business that can sustain you full-time. You're not risking everything on a fantasy, Tyler. You're investing in something you've already proven works at smaller scale. There's a difference between reckless gambling and calculated risk. The lawyer called back Monday morning with a rate quote that made me wince but seemed reasonable given the urgency. We scheduled a meeting for that afternoon to review the contract line by line. Her name was Rachel Vance, and she worked with several small food producers navigating retail contracts. She spent 2 hours going through every clause, explaining implications, suggesting minor modifications I could request, and ultimately confirming what I'd already suspected. The contract was demanding but fair, typical for Walmart vendor agreements, and if I could deliver on the terms, it was worth signing. The termination clauses are what you really need to pay attention to, Rachel said, highlighting a section in the middle of the document. If you miss delivery windows by more than 48 hours twice in the 3-month trial, they can terminate immediately with no penalty on their end. That's strict, but it's also how they protect themselves from unreliable vendors. You need to be absolutely certain you can hit these timelines before you sign. I can hit them, I said, and hoped I was right. The other thing to watch is the exclusivity clause, Rachel continued. For the duration of this contract, you can't sell to any other major retailer in the same geographic region. That means if another chain approaches you, you'll have to turn them down or negotiate out of this agreement. Make sure you're comfortable with that limitation. I hadn't thought about other retailers approaching me, had been so focused on Walmart that the possibility of multiple opportunities hadn't even crossed my mind. But Rachel was right that it was a limitation worth considering. Still, standing at the door and worrying about what other doors might exist felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I'm comfortable with it, I said. Walmart is the opportunity one needs to focus on right now. I left Rachel's office with a contract I finally understood, and a bill for legal services that depleted my savings more than I wanted to acknowledge. But I also had confidence that I was making an informed decision, instead of just charging forward on hope and stubbornness. Tuesday morning I applied for a small business loan, submitting the Walmart contract as proof of projected income and Patricia's Kitchen agreement as evidence of production capability. The lender said I'd hear back within 24 hours. My father called that afternoon, the first direct contact since his text on Saturday. I almost didn't answer, but some part of me still held on to the possibility that he might surprise me, that he might have reconsidered his position after learning about the contract offer. Tyler, he said when I picked up, and his voice carried that particular tone of patient disappointment he'd perfected over the years. I'm calling because I care about you, and I need you to really hear what I'm about to say. This Walmart thing is a trap. They're going to dangle a contract with impossible terms, watch you fail to deliver, then terminate the agreement and leave you with debt and no way to recover. I've seen this happen to other small producers. The big retailers do this. They chew people up. I've had a lawyer review the contract, I said, trying to keep my voice level. The terms are demanding but fair. Jennifer Walsh isn't setting me up to fail. She's offering an opportunity that most small producers would do anything to get. Because most small producers are desperate and don't understand corporate strategy, my father shot back. You're making a massive mistake, and when it falls apart, I'm not cleaning up the mess. I've offered you legitimate alternatives, stable options that would actually build towards something sustainable. But you're so committed to proving me wrong that you'd rather crash publicly than admit I might know what I'm talking about. Something in that phrasing made me go still. Crash publicly? Is that what you're hoping for? That I'll fail in a way everyone can see so you can be right? The silence on the other end lasted too long. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something colder. I'm hoping you'll come to your senses before you destroy your future. But if you won't listen to reason, then yes, maybe a public failure is what it'll take for you to finally understand your limitations. I hung up without responding, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. He'd said it out loud finally, admitted what I'd suspected for years. He wasn't trying to protect me from disappointment. He was invested in my failure, needed me to crash so his certainty about my limitations could be validated. The cruelty of it hit harder than any of his previous dismissals, the confirmation that he'd actively prefer to watch me fall than admit he'd been wrong about what I was capable of building. The loan approval came through Tuesday evening, $32,000 at an interest rate that made me queasy but seemed manageable if the Walmart trial performed even moderately well. I signed the loan documents with hands that wanted to shake, then immediately used half the funds to secure additional kitchen time, order ingredients at volume, and pay the first installment on the increased insurance the contract required. Wednesday morning arrived bright and cold, the kind of weather that felt like the universe paying attention. I drove to a FedEx office with the signed Walmart contract, having made every modification Rachel suggested and verified every detail 3 times. The moment I handed that envelope to the clerk and watched them scan it into the system felt like stepping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Jennifer Walsh confirmed receipt 2 hours later with an email that was brief and professional. Received your signed agreement. Welcome to the Walmart vendor family. Your first delivery window is in 6 weeks. Production timeline and specifications attached. Looking forward to seeing Ember and Oak on our shelves. I sat in my truck in the FedEx parking lot and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd just done. I'd signed a contract that would either transform my garage hobby into a legitimate business or prove every doubt my father had ever voiced. There was no middle ground anymore. No safe space between success and failure. I was all in for better or worse. Jordan called minutes later, having apparently set an alert for when I'd send the contract. It's official? They asked, voice tight with anticipation. It's official, I confirmed. First delivery in 6 weeks. 10,000 bottles. Everything we've been planning for, except now it's real and terrifying. We've got this, Jordan said with conviction I wished I felt. Tomorrow we start hiring production help. I've already posted ads on the local food industry boards. And I took 3 weeks leave from my job so I can help full-time with the first production run. You're not doing this alone, Tyler. You've never been doing this alone. That afternoon the article from Diana Pacheco published in the Austin Business Journal. She'd titled it From Farmers Markets to Walmart, Local Hot Sauce Producer Lands Major Retail Contract. The piece featured photos of me at my farmer's market booth, samples of Ember and Oak lined up on my garage prep table, and quotes about building a business from nothing while navigating family dynamics that didn't support the journey. She'd included my comment about my father not believing in the business, had quoted me saying, I'm the one who insists on doing things differently, which apparently means I'm either reckless or naive. The article framed it as an inspirational story about persistence in the face of doubt, about young entrepreneurs creating opportunity instead of waiting for approval. My phone started buzzing within an hour of publication. Friends texting congratulations, former farmers market customers saying they'd look for Ember and Oak at Walmart, strangers from the Austin food community reaching out to offer support or advice. The attention felt overwhelming and validating at once, proof that what I'd built mattered to people beyond my immediate circle. But mixed in with the congratulations were 3 messages that made my stomach drop. One from my mother saying, "Did you have to mention your father in that article?" Another from Brandon saying, "Way to air family business publicly. Real professional." And one from my father himself that just said, "You've made your choice. Don't expect me to be there when this falls apart." I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by all the notifications and messages, feeling the full complexity of what success in defiance of your family actually meant. I'd won the opportunity I'd been fighting for, had proven that my business was worth Walmart's investment, had built something real enough to warrant a business journal feature. But I'd also lost something in the process, or maybe just finally acknowledged what had never really been there. My family's support had always been conditional on me following their approved path, and the moment I'd chosen differently, that support had evaporated into criticism and opposition. The next 6 weeks became a blur of production intensity that made everything I'd done before feel like practice. Jordan and I hired 3 people to help with production, training them on my recipes and quality standards, while simultaneously ramping up ingredient orders and coordinating kitchen schedules with Patricia. We worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week. Our entire existence narrowed down to bottles and labels and delivery timelines that felt impossible until we somehow met them. There were problems constantly, the kind that would have broken me if I'd been facing them alone. A pepper supplier had quality issues 3 weeks in. forcing me to find a replacement vendor on 48 hours' notice. The label printer delivered the wrong design, requiring a rush reorder that ate into margins I couldn't afford to lose. One of the production assistants quit after 2 weeks, overwhelmed by the pace, and we absorbed his duties while scrambling to find someone new. But we also found rhythms, discovered efficiencies, built systems that turned chaos into something more like controlled urgency. By week 5, we were consistently hitting daily production targets. By week 6, we'd produced all 10,000 bottles with 3 days to spare before the delivery window. Jordan and I sat in Patricia's kitchen at 2 a.m. after the last bottle was labeled, surrounded by cases ready for shipment, too exhausted to celebrate but too relieved not to. "We did it," Jordan said, voice hoarse from weeks of intensity. "We actually did it." The delivery went smoothly. All 10,000 bottles shipped to Walmart's distribution center, and confirmed received with no quality issues or delays. Jennifer Walsh sent a brief email acknowledging the successful delivery, and noting that performance tracking would begin immediately. Now came the waiting, the 60 days of watching sales data to see if customers actually wanted to buy what I'd worked so hard to produce. My father didn't call to ask how the delivery went. My mother sent a single text saying, "Hope everything worked out with your Walmart thing." Brandon posted on social media about closing another major deal, and both my parents commented with enthusiasm that felt pointed in its contrast to their silence about my accomplishment. The Austin Business Journal ran a follow-up piece about my successful delivery, noting that few first-time vendors managed to hit Walmart's demanding timelines without issues. Diana quoted me saying, "The people who believed in this business made it possible. Turns out you don't need everyone's approval to build something worth building." Sales data started coming in 2 weeks after delivery, and the numbers were better than projected. Ember & Oak was outperforming other products in the same category, with sell-through rates that had Jennifer Walsh emailing to discuss the 200-store expansion earlier than planned. By week 8 of the trial, 3 stores had sold completely out and were requesting emergency restocks. By week 10, Jennifer was talking about national distribution timelines. The expansion contract arrived at the end of the 3-month trial period, upgrading me from 50 stores to 300 across the Southwest region. The production requirements were massive, the delivery schedules even tighter, but Patricia had already been planning for this possibility. We expanded to a second kitchen space, hired 6 more production staff, and I finally quit the part-time job I'd been holding onto as safety net. Ember & Oak became my full-time work, the thing I'd been building towards since that first batch of hot sauce in my apartment kitchen 3 years earlier. Jordan moved into a production manager role, coordinating schedules and suppliers while I focused on quality control and business development. We were exhausted constantly, stressed beyond anything I'd imagined, but we were also building something real, something that existed independent of my family's approval or participation. 6 months after signing the initial Walmart contract, Jennifer Walsh called with news that made my hands shake. National distribution approval had come through. Ember & Oak would be stocked in over 2,000 Walmart stores across the country, with projections for annual sales that would make it a sustainable, profitable business. I'd done it. I'd taken a farmer's market side project and transformed it into something that could actually support me, that could grow into whatever I had the vision and stamina to build. The Austin Business Journal ran a feature profile, calling me one of the city's entrepreneurial success stories. Local news picked up the narrative, the hot sauce guy who'd proven doubters wrong and built a business from nothing. My face was suddenly recognizable around town, people stopping me in coffee shops to say they'd tried Ember & Oak and loved it, that they'd been following my story and found it inspiring. Through all of it, my family stayed silent. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that anything significant had happened. I stopped checking for their approval, stopped hoping they'd reach out to admit they'd been wrong. Their silence became its own answer, proof that some people would rather maintain their certainty than celebrate success that didn't fit their narrative. A year after signing that first contract, I moved into a loft in East Austin that had actual space and natural light and room to think about what came next. Jordan and I stood on the balcony overlooking the city, drinking beer and reflecting on how completely life had changed in 12 months. "Your father ever reach out?" Jordan asked, the question careful but necessary. "No," I said simply, "and I've stopped waiting for it." He invested in a version of me that didn't exist, and when I refused to become that person, He chose his imaginary son over the real one. That's on him, not me. My phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer Walsh, asking if I'd be interested in developing a second product line for the Texas Artisan program. More opportunity, more growth, more proof that what I'd built was worth building. I showed Jordan the email, and we grinned at each other with the kind of exhausted satisfaction that comes from surviving something that should have broken you. The Austin skyline glowed in the evening light, full of possibility and challenge, and the future I was creating one bottle at a time. Somewhere across town, my father was probably still certain I'd eventually fail, still waiting for the crash that would validate his warnings. But I wasn't building my business for his validation anymore. I was building it because I could, because people wanted what I made, because Jordan and Patricia and Diana and countless others had believed in me when belief mattered most. Freedom wasn't proving my father wrong. It was finally understanding that his opinion of my potential had never been accurate, had never been about me at all. He'd looked at his own limitations and projected them onto me, had mistaken his fears for my reality. And the moment I'd stopped accepting his assessment as truth, everything had changed. The second product line launched 8 months later, a smoky verde sauce that customers had been requesting since Ember and Oak first hit Walmart shelves. Jennifer had pushed for the expansion, noting that my brand recognition was strong enough to support multiple SKUs, and the development process felt almost surreal compared to those early days in my garage. I had a team now, actual employees who depended on my business for their livelihoods. I had relationships with suppliers who treated me like a legitimate account instead of a hopeful amateur. I had systems and processes and a production facility that could handle volume I'd once thought impossible. The verde sauce performed even better than the original Chipotle blend, selling out in test markets within 2 weeks and generating customer reviews that made me read them multiple times just to believe they were real. People were connecting with what I'd built, finding something in these bottles that resonated beyond just flavor. The brand had become associated with persistence, with building something authentic in a world of mass-produced mediocrity, and that narrative seemed to matter as much as the actual product. Jordan had transitioned into a full business partner role, taking equity in exchange for the year they'd invested in making Ember and Oak viable. We'd formalized the arrangement with contracts and official documentation, turning our friendship into a legal partnership that felt both strange and absolutely right. They'd been there since the beginning, had believed when belief required imagination rather than evidence, and it seemed only fair that they'd share in the success they'd helped create. The Austin food scene embraced Ember and Oak in ways I hadn't anticipated, with local restaurants featuring the sauces on their tables and food bloggers creating content around recipes using our products. I got invited to speak on panels about entrepreneurship and small business growth, sharing stages with people I'd admired from a distance when I was still mixing peppers in my apartment. The recognition felt validating but also slightly unreal, like I was playing a role instead of just living my actual life. Through all of it, my family remained a distant presence that occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. I'd see my mother at the grocery store and we'd exchange awkward pleasantries that carefully avoided mentioning business. Brandon sent a LinkedIn connection request that I ignored, unable to bridge the gap between his dismissal during the hard years and his apparent interest now that success was visible. My father never reached out directly, but I'd hear through mutual acquaintances that he'd been seen buying Ember and Oak at Walmart, though whether that represented support or curiosity or something else entirely, I couldn't say. The holidays came and went without invitations to family gatherings, an absence that hurt less than I expected. Jordan's family adopted me for Thanksgiving, treating me with the warmth my own family had reserved for Brandon, and I found myself grateful for the chosen family I'd built rather than bitter about the biological one I'd lost. Christmas felt similar, celebrated with friends and employees who'd become something closer than colleagues, people who understood what we'd all worked to create together. In February, 2 years after that first Farmers Market Expo where Jennifer Walsh had approached me, the Austin Business Journal named me one of their 30 under 30 entrepreneurs to watch. The recognition came with a gala event, a professional photo shoot, and a feature article that traced my journey from garage production to national distribution. Diana Pacheco wrote the piece, having followed my story from the beginning, and her final paragraph captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't quite articulated. Tyler Bennett built Ember and Oak without the advantages many entrepreneurs rely on: family capital, industry connections, or mentorship from successful business owners. What he had instead was stubbornness, a quality product, and the wisdom to surround himself with people who believed in possibility over certainty. In an entrepreneurial landscape increasingly dominated by well-funded startups and legacy businesses, Bennett represents something both rare and essential, proof that you can still build something significant from nothing if you're willing to work harder than everyone around you thinks is reasonable. The gala was formal and crowded with people I didn't know. Austin's business elite gathering to celebrate achievement and network with rising entrepreneurs. I wore a suit Jordan had insisted I buy, feeling simultaneously proud and out of place among people whose success often traced back to family money or privileged connections. But when they called my name for the award presentation and I walked onto that stage, looking out at the audience applauding, I felt something shift inside me. I hadn't just built a business. I'd proven that the story my father told about my limitations was fiction, that his certainty about my inevitable failure said more about his fears than my capabilities. Standing on that stage holding an award that recognized what I'd accomplished despite his opposition felt like closing a chapter I'd been writing for longer than the business had existed. The acceptance speech I'd prepared felt inadequate when I actually started speaking, so I abandoned it halfway through and just told the truth. I talked about starting in a garage while people I loved insisted I was wasting my time. I mentioned the farmer's market booth where I'd learned to pitch my product to strangers who had no reason to care. I acknowledged Jordan by name, calling them the partner who'd made everything possible by believing before there was evidence to justify that belief. And I said something I hadn't planned to say, words that came out before I could second-guess them. The hardest part of building Ember and Oak wasn't the production challenges or the financial pressure or the fear of failure. It was learning to trust my own assessment of what was possible when everyone around me was certain I was wrong. Success doesn't always look like what the people who raised you expect it to look like, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is build it anyway. The applause that followed felt different than the polite recognition at the beginning, warmer and more genuine, like I'd said something that resonated beyond my specific story. People approached me afterward with their own versions of family doubt and entrepreneurial struggle, treating me like I understood something worth sharing. And maybe I did, not because I was particularly wise but because I'd lived through the specific pain of building something while the people closest to you wait for it to collapse. Jordan found me on the venue's terrace an hour into the reception, needing a break from the networking intensity inside. We stood looking out at the Austin skyline, both of us quiet for a moment before Jordan spoke. "Your family didn't come," they said, not quite a question. "They weren't invited," I replied, which wasn't entirely true but felt true enough. I could have reached out, but I didn't want them here. This night isn't about them finally recognizing what I built. It's about celebrating it with people who were actually part of making it happen. Jordan nodded slowly, and I could feel them choosing their next words carefully. "You ever think about reaching out though? Not for them but for you. To close that loop or get whatever closure might exist." I'd thought about it constantly, had drafted emails and texts I never sent, had imagined confrontations where I'd finally say everything I'd held back. But every time I got close to actually reaching out, I'd remember my father's voice on that phone call saying maybe public failure was what it would take for me to understand my limitations. I'd remember his silence when I delivered that first Walmart order successfully. I'd remember the way my mother had asked if I really needed to mention my father in the Business Journal article, like my honesty about our dynamic was somehow worse than his active opposition to my dreams. "I don't think there's closure available," I said finally. "My father's invested in a version of reality where I'm supposed to fail, and my success is a problem for that narrative. Reaching out would just give him another chance to explain why what I've built doesn't count or isn't sustainable or will eventually collapse. I'm done volunteering for conversations where I have to defend my right to exist differently than he planned." We went back inside before the cold got uncomfortable, rejoining the reception and the networking and the celebration of achievements that all these people had fought to make real. I exchanged business cards with restaurant owners and food distributors, had conversations about potential partnerships and expansion opportunities, played the role of successful entrepreneur with increasing comfort. This was my world now, built from farmers' market tables and garage production runs and the kind of stubborn determination that looks like foolishness until it works. The expansion into natural food stores happened 6 months later, a parallel distribution channel that Jennifer had suggested to diversify beyond Walmart's footprint. Whole Foods picked up both Ember and Oak products for their Southwest region, and smaller chains followed. Each new account felt like validation, proof that the business had legs beyond a single retail partnership, that I'd built something with genuine market demand, rather than just gotten lucky with one buyer's interest. Revenue crossed $1 million annually that fall, a number that felt both enormous and somehow insufficient given how much work had gone into reaching it. Jordan and I hired a small business consultant to help us think about scaling sustainably, about building infrastructure that could support growth without consuming us completely. We were still working 60-hour weeks regularly, still solving problems constantly, but the business had evolved from desperate survival into something more strategic and intentional. My apartment had become an office by necessity, with product samples and business documents competing for space with actual living. I started looking at commercial office space, recognizing that Ember and Oak had outgrown the scrappy startup phase where everything happened in whatever space was available. Jordan pushed for it, arguing that having a real office would help with hiring and projecting professionalism to larger accounts. We signed a lease on a small suite in East Austin, finally giving the business a physical home that wasn't my garage or someone's kitchen. The office warming party felt like another milestone, another marker of having built something real. Employees and suppliers and industry contacts filled the space, celebrating not just the new location but what it represented. Patricia came from Pflugerville, bringing a gift basket of specialty ingredients and a card that made me tear up when I read it later. Watched you grow from a kid with pepper plants to a businessman with a national brand. Keep building. The industry needs more people like you. 3 years after signing that first Walmart contract, Ember and Oak was generating enough profit for Jordan and me to take actual salaries instead of just covering expenses and reinvesting everything into growth. The moment I deposited that first substantial paycheck felt surreal, tangible proof that the business could actually support me the way my father had been so certain it never would. I bought a new truck to replace the one that had been dying slowly for months, and driving it off the lot felt like acknowledging a level of stability I'd spent years working toward. But stability came with its own complications, its own questions about what came next. Jennifer Walsh had been talking about international distribution, about opportunities in Canada and Mexico, where American artisan products had growing market interest. The production requirements would be massive, the logistics complex, the risk significant. But it was also the next level of growth, the thing that would transform Ember and Oak from a regional success story into something genuinely substantial. Jordan and I spent weeks debating whether we were ready for international expansion, whether the infrastructure we built could handle that level of complexity. We brought in the business consultant, ran financial projections, mapped out supply chain challenges. Every analysis pointed toward the same conclusion. It was risky but viable, demanding but possible. The only question was whether we wanted to commit to another phase of intense growth or consolidate what we'd already built. We were sitting in our office late on a Thursday evening, surrounded by expansion proposals and market research, when Jordan asked the question that had been hanging between us. What are you actually building toward, Tyler? Is this about proving something? Or is this about building the biggest business possible? Or is it something else? I didn't have a clean answer, had been avoiding that question even as we made decisions that implied an answer. Part of me was still motivated by proving my father wrong, by building something so undeniable that his dismissal would look foolish in retrospect. But that motivation had started feeling hollow, like I was still letting him define my ambitions even in his absence. Another part of me genuinely loved the work, found satisfaction in creating products people wanted, and building a company that treated employees well, and contributed positively to the Austin food scene. I don't want to spend my whole life chasing the next level of growth just to prove I can, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it. But I also don't want to play it safe because I'm scared of failing at something bigger. Maybe international expansion is worth pursuing not because I need to prove anything, but because it's the natural next evolution of what we've built. Jordan nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer even though it wasn't particularly definitive. We agreed to move forward with preliminary planning for international distribution, taking it slow enough to ensure we didn't overextend but committed enough to pursue the opportunity seriously. Jennifer connected us with Walmart's international vendor team, and the process of exploring Canadian distribution began. 4 years after that Farmers Market Expo, Ember and Oak crossed into Canada with a 100-store trial in Ontario and Quebec. The logistics were complicated by border regulations and different labeling requirements, But the product performed well enough that expansion to Western provinces followed within 6 months. Mexico came next, a smaller test market in border cities that showed promising early results. The business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined in that garage, beyond the scope of farmers markets and local success into something genuinely international. The Austin Business Journal ran another feature. This one focused on local brands expanding globally. Diana interviewed me again, and I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since our first conversation 5 years earlier. I'd gone from defending my right to pursue a business my family dismissed to running an operation with 30 employees and distribution across 3 countries. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, built from thousands of small decisions that had accumulated into something substantial. Do you ever think about what your father would say if he could see this? Diana asked near the end of the interview, and I appreciated her willingness to ask the uncomfortable question directly. Sometimes, I admitted, but less than I used to. At a certain point, building your life around someone else's approval or disapproval gives them too much power over your story. He was wrong about my potential, wrong about what I could build, wrong about the market demand for artisan products. Those facts exist independent of whether he acknowledges them. I've stopped needing his validation to know my business is real. The article ran with that quote as a pullout, and I got messages from dozens of other entrepreneurs who'd faced similar family dynamics. People shared stories of parents who'd dismissed their ambitions, relatives who'd predicted failure, family members who still hadn't acknowledged success years after it became undeniable. The common thread was the specific pain of building something significant while the people closest to you either actively opposed it or stayed conspicuously silent. I started getting invited to speak at universities and entrepreneurship conferences, sharing the Ember and Oak story as a case study in bootstrap growth and persistence despite opposition. The speaking felt uncomfortable at first, too much attention on me rather than the product or the team that had made everything possible. But I learned to frame it less as personal narrative and more as strategic lessons, talking about supply chain management and retail partnerships and scaling production while maintaining quality. At one conference in Houston, a young woman approached me after my presentation with tears in her eyes. She explained that her family had been pressuring her to abandon her catering business and take a corporate job, that they'd told her she was wasting her culinary degree on something that would never be profitable. Hearing my story had given her permission to keep building, to trust her own assessment of what was possible rather than accepting her family's certainty about her limitations. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. The recognition that my willingness to share the difficult parts of my journey had given someone else courage to persist with theirs. Maybe that was part of what building in public accomplished, not just documenting success but acknowledging the cost of pursuing it when the people who raised you thought you were making a mistake. 5 years after signing the first Walmart contract, my mother reached out with a text that appeared on my phone like an artifact from a different life. Your father had a health scare. He's fine now, but it made him reflective. He asked if you'd be willing to meet for coffee. No pressure, just wanted to pass along the message. I stared at that text for days, unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to maintain the boundaries I'd built that kept my family's dysfunction from contaminating the life I'd created. Another part wondered if this was the opening for closure Jordan had asked about years earlier, the chance to finally have an honest conversation without the performance of family dinner dynamics. Jordan's advice was characteristically direct. You don't owe him anything, but you might owe yourself the chance to say what you need to say. Just go in knowing he might not give you what you're hoping for. People rarely change as much as health scares make us think they will. I agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop downtown, arriving 15 minutes early to secure a table and settle my nerves. My father walked in exactly on time, looking older than I remembered, moving with a carefulness that suggested the health scare had been more serious than my mother's text had implied. We shook hands awkwardly, and he ordered coffee with the same precise specifications I remembered from childhood. We sat down and the silence stretched uncomfortably, neither of us sure how to begin a conversation that carried 5 years of absence and hurt. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than I expected. Your mother showed me the Business Journal articles. The award, the international expansion, all of it. I wanted to tell you that I was wrong about your business. You built something real, something I didn't think was possible. The words should have felt like vindication, like everything I'd been waiting to hear. Instead, they landed flat, insufficient for the years of opposition and silence. I found myself responding before I'd consciously decided what to say. You weren't just wrong about my business, Dad. You were wrong about me. You decided I didn't have what it took to succeed at something you hadn't designed, and when I proved otherwise, you stayed silent because acknowledging my success would mean admitting your assessment was flawed. That's not the same as honest mistake. That's active investment in my failure. His face tightened, that familiar look he got when someone challenged his authority or judgment. For a moment I thought he'd revert to the dismissive certainty I remembered, but instead he looked down at his coffee and nodded slightly. You're right, he said, and the admission shocked me more than anything else could have. I convinced myself I was protecting you from disappointment, but really I was protecting myself from being wrong. Brandon followed my path and succeeded in ways I understood. You insisted on doing something different, and I took that as rejection instead of just recognizing it as you becoming your own person. I'm sorry for that. Genuinely sorry. We talked for 2 hours, the conversation ranging across years of misunderstandings and hurt and missed opportunities for connection. He asked about the business with what seemed like genuine interest, and I found myself explaining production challenges and retail negotiations with the enthusiasm I'd learned to reserve for people who actually cared. He told me about the health scare, a heart episode that had forced him to confront his mortality and his priorities, that had made him recognize how much of his identity had been wrapped up in control and certainty. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, didn't erase the years of opposition or magically repair our relationship. But it was honest in a way our family had never managed before, an acknowledgement of harm done and patterns that needed breaking. When we parted, he asked if we could try meeting regularly, rebuilding some version of a relationship without the weight of his expectations determining my worth. I said yes cautiously, knowing that trust would have to be earned slowly through changed behavior rather than granted immediately based on apology. Jordan asked how it went, and I struggled to summarize something that felt too complex for easy explanation. He apologized, I said finally. Actually apologized, which I didn't expect. Whether that translates into real change or just momentary reflection, I don't know yet. But it felt like something shifted, like maybe there's room for a relationship that doesn't require me to be someone I'm not. Ember and Oak continued growing, expanded into new product lines and new markets, became the thing I'd imagined during those early morning garage sessions when success felt impossibly distant. But the business stopped being about proving anything to anyone except myself and the customers who connected with what we'd built. My father and I met for coffee monthly, slowly building something that resembled a functional relationship, though it would never quite overcome the years of hurt that preceded it. The most surprising development came 2 years later when Brandon reached out asking if we could talk. We met at the same coffee shop where my father and I had started our reconciliation, and he looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. His perfect career trajectory had hit complications, deals falling through and partnerships dissolving in ways that had shaken his confidence in the path our father had laid out for him. I've been jealous of you, he admitted, the words clearly difficult to speak. You built something that's yours, something Dad couldn't take credit for or control. I followed his plan and achieved his version of success, but I don't know if any of it is actually mine. Watching you build Ember and Oak made me realize I've been performing someone else's life. We talked about family dynamics and expectations and the different ways we'd both been shaped by our father's certainty about how success was supposed to look. It didn't erase the years where Brandon had been the favored son while I'd been dismissed, but it complicated my understanding of his experience, revealed that he'd paid his own cost for that favoritism. Looking back from the distance of years and success and hard-won stability, I could see that building Ember and Oak had never really been about hot sauce. It had been about proving to myself that I could trust my own judgment even when everyone around me insisted I was wrong, that I could build something significant from nothing if I was willing to work harder than reasonable people thought was sensible. The business became successful because I refused to quit when quitting would have been easier and more comfortable for everyone around me. But the real victory wasn't the revenue or the distribution, or the awards recognizing what I'd built. It was the morning I woke up in my East Austin loft, checked my phone and saw another strong sales report, and realized I no longer needed anyone's validation to know my choices had been right. My father's approval would have been nice to have earlier, but its absence hadn't stopped me from building exactly what I'd set out to create. Freedom wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about building a life so full of purpose and genuine achievement that other people's doubts became background noise instead of obstacles I had to overcome. And standing in that freedom, looking at everything Ember and Oak had become, I finally understood what Jordan had been trying to tell me from the beginning. The people who matter believe in you before there's evidence. Everyone else is just watching to see if you'll prove them wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.